My name's Cherise Bunn, and I'm the Director of Education for Oregon Women in Higher Education this year. Welcome to our July webinar, Unpacking Unconscious Bias. We have two amazing presenters from Reed College who are going to be presenting this to us today. There are other webinars coming up that I just wanted to let you all know about. They're available on our website, as well as conference registration is going to be opening up soon. So a great way to network with Dayspring and Claudia and other members of OE. I know that the two presenters have a lot to share with you today, and so we're actually going to jump in. This recording will be available to you all on YouTube after the presentation, and we will also have like stuff we'll share with you. So just pay attention to that. You'll get emails, follow-up emails from me actually with that. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Claudia and Dayspring. Please make sure to utilize the Zoom group chat. If you have questions, there will be time at the end and I'll be helping facilitate that. So feel free to type the questions and I'll see those throughout. With that, I'm going to mute myself so that our presenters can start.
Hi everyone, my name is Claudia Ramirez Islas and I am the Assistant Director for the Office of Student Engagement at Reed College.
Hi everyone, my name is Dayspring Matol and I'm the Assistant Dean of Students for Inclusive Community here at Reed. We're so happy to be talking with you today. Thank you so much, Cherise, for facilitating this and for inviting us to do this webinar. And we wanted to just start off by giving a little bit of context. So as Cherise shared, this was a 3-hour pre-conference workshop that we initially did in January at the OE conference. And really our goal with that session, as well as the shorter webinar today, is to take this concept of unconscious bias that many of us are maybe familiar with on kind of a theoretical lens and really have some discussion about it that's more grounded in our own experiences and stories. So we really want to acknowledge the diversity within even this group today of webinar participants and the range of perspectives and experiences that we all bring, especially as we think about our firsthand experiences with unconscious bias.
Great. So with that, we want to jump right into our learning outcomes. So for this webinar, participants will definitely deepen their understanding of unconscious bias and its effects, not only in the workplace, but also beyond in your daily routine and life. We'll also take a little bit of time to do a little bit of reflection on our own biases and experiences. And we will also talk about some best practices to be resilient in the workplace and in the different settings in which we engage with others. And then we will also navigate the power of mentorship and building community and understanding and navigating unconscious bias that we face. And hopefully also too, by the end of this webinar, everyone will be empowered to really apply the learned skills to be leaders, especially during a time of change.
So what is unconscious bias? This is obviously a complex topic. There's a lot of research on it. For the purposes of this presentation, we're thinking about unconscious bias as a prejudice that we have or an assumption that we make about another person or group that's really based on common cultural stereotypes rather than a thoughtful judgment. And another key piece is that this is something that's happening in our subconscious. So typically something that's a gut reaction that we're not aware of. We're not consciously making these assumptions, but that's a built-in an unconscious assumption that we're making. So the quote up here is from Verna Myers, who's a really powerful social justice educator and advocate. And we're going to reference a TED Talk from her later in this presentation. But she says that biases are the stories that we make up about people before we know who they actually are.
Great. So that also brings us to another point, which is unconscious bias and how we see the world through our filters. And so a lot of our biases is based off of our own life experience and our identities that we have. And so some filters in which we may see and navigate the world could be based off of gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, relationship status, geographic location, perceived sexual orientation, identity expression, and things that maybe we don't often think about outside of the higher ed setting, but things like sizeism, so like the shape that I'm at, the shape that I am, my age, maybe my socioeconomic status or my physical ability, or the way that I'm perceived by others based off of the clothing that I'm wearing, or my body language, do I have any accents, the activities that I'm involved in outside of work, or also even political beliefs and parental status. Are you a single parent? And also to things like educational background.
So as we were saying before, there's a lot of research about this concept out there. So first, we wanted to touch on some of the neuroscience and the research about kind of how our brains function. And so what's happening behind the scenes cognitively with some of these snap judgments. So there's a growing number of studies that show a direct link between our hidden biases and our actual behavior. In other words, hidden biases can be kind of unmasked in the midst of our real life and our real life actions, especially in those moments when we're operating more so out of impulse and not necessarily making a conscious decision about what we're doing. So in those moments of when we're stressed, when we're distracted, even when we're really relaxed, or when we're in a competitive environment, those are times when we're really acting more out of reflex. And so that's when our hidden biases can really be unmasked. So some of what we know from some of this brain research is that at any given moment, we are taking in as many as 11 million pieces of information all at the same time. So our brain has this huge influx of information coming in, but we can only process about 40 pieces of info at that moment. So there's obviously no way we can take that all in and process it. Another piece is that our prefrontal cortex, which is really responsible for managing those complex cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functions, is dramatically smaller than the rest of our brain. And it allows us to be creative. It has that ability to adapt. But in order to adapt, it really needs to be attentive. And our brains often avoid being that attentive to detail because it takes too much energy. And so our brains kind of have this tendency to be a bit lazy and as we're taking in all of this information to try to categorize it and start operating based on patterns. Another point is that our brain actually activates a sense of pain when there are threats to our status, autonomy, certainty, relatedness, or fairness is experienced. So we avoid this pain by going the easiest way, and that kind of becomes the default of our brain. And then finally, any emotion that causes change, whether we kind of bigger changes to the system, whether we are expressing it or suppressing it, there's a physiological response that happens along with that emotion. So our memory gets worse, our blood pressure can increase. So when we have these heightened states of stress, there's a physiological response, and that is when our hidden biases can come out. So then shifting from some of that brain research into some of the research also within the realm of social psychology, there's a lot of really interesting studies out there. So studies have found, for example, that school teachers clearly telegraph prejudices, so much so that some researchers believe that children of color and white children in the same classroom are effectively experiencing completely different educations based on the nonverbals of how the teachers are responding to kids, the way they're making eye contact, who they're calling on, the way that they're showing emotional connections. All of these things are happening typically subconsciously for the teacher. They're not intending to discriminate, but those studies basically show that the kids in the same classroom with the same teacher are having completely different educations. And similar studies have kind of showed that same experience for students with disabilities as well as LGBTQ students. And so this is really relevant for those of us working in higher education who maybe think about students and the biases that they might be experiencing when they get to college, but it's really important for us to think about how deeply rooted these experiences of bias have already been for students of color, LGBTQ students, students with disabilities, and many others by the time they even walk in the door and get to our campuses. Another really well-known and kind of classic experiment showed that within the context of job interviews, white interviewers often sat further away from Black applicants than they did from white applicants. They made more speech errors. They ended the interviews 25% sooner. And so separate studies talk about those kinds of behaviors and that type of discrimination as being understandably negative and having diminishing the performance of anyone who's treated that way, regardless of their background. So if we know that that is happening more often for candidates of color, we can imagine the impact that has on their professional experience in the workplace climate. Another important area of research on this topic is from psychologist Claude Steele and others. So you might be familiar with the concept of stereotype threat. So the work, Claude Steele's work talks about stereotype as a predicament in which people feel themselves to be at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about their social group. So for example, studies indicate that African-American teenagers are aware when they're stigmatized as being intellectually inferior, and that they go to school every day bearing what he calls a burden of suspicion. And that burden can affect attitudes, their achievement, their actual educational experience. Similar studies have found that when college women are reminded that women are considered bad at math or computer science, those women might actually fulfill that prophecy. So in those studies, when they're reminded of that stereotype, their performance typically goes down.
Great. And so for the purposes of this webinar, we want to draw upon 4 different types of unconscious bias that have been pulled from different areas of research. And we've listed them here on the slide. So love of the same states that we are mostly drawn to people who are like us, which in turn can have the potential of creating unconscious bias. So an example of that is things that like, who are we hiring and what are hiring practices and tendencies? Do we naturally gravitate towards hiring individuals who are most like us, whether that's through gender, race, ethnicity? And so we have to continuously ask ourselves if our team is diverse in not only experience, but also in thought. Also too, in-group versus out-group, or us versus them, states that that can create tendencies of creating cliques within different groups. And that kind of builds up on the love of the same, which means that if we're constantly wanting to hang out and be around those individuals who are similar to us, then we have a higher tendency of creating small groups or pockets of groups that are unconsciously biased, and that can create spaces that are not very inclusive to others who are different from us. Stereotype talks about oversimplified generalizations, and so sometimes we maybe don't account for individuals' differences, especially if we do not naturally choose or gravitate towards those who are different from us. And so we might have a higher tendency to groupthink if we're just hanging out or being with people or working with people who have a similar thought process or similar identities and backgrounds. And so that can also be a very concerning place to be at, and that can allude to unconscious bias. And then as far as confirmation bias, that concept talks about how we may think we know something, or we seek out to see evidence to prove it. And so I think sometimes that could be sort of a defense mechanism, and we don't want to acknowledge that like maybe we are ourselves being unconsciously biased towards others, and so we try to find false facts that sort of affirm that unconscious bias. So some of the examples of that could be that maybe as we're facing conflict with someone, it could be that we're only seeking the advice and confiding in those who with similar backgrounds from us that might in return to sort of tell us like, oh, this is okay, you're seeing things through this correct lens, versus opening up our perspective to the differences that we may be missing because of different identities and such. So with all that, we also want to point out that unconscious bias does have can have a negative impact in the different communities that we're part of. It could lead to microaggressions. It could affect salary, who gets a promotion, who gets hired, and can also influence organizational culture. So I know towards the end of the webinar, we'll be sending out a few of the handouts that we used during our pre-con, and it will also detail out a couple of the impacts of unconscious bias, and you'll be getting that shortly.
So for more on this topic, throughout the presentation, we're going to include on the slides links to some relevant TED Talks that we think are really useful for unpacking this concept further from a few different lenses. So each of the TED Talks we highlight kind of comes at this topic from a different lens, which we think is really important. We're not really going to talk about this at all right now. We obviously won't watch it, but we wanted to include it in the slides so that you can reference it later and go back and find the link. So this is a talk by Helen Turnbull, who's a diversity advocate and speaker and trainer. And she kind of does like a basic 101 introduction to unconscious bias and what it is.
Great. So now we're going to take a little time to pause and do a little bit of a reflection. Now that we've defined unconscious bias and talked a little bit about its impacts. So let's take a few minutes to answer, sort of think about these questions. And if your form of reflecting is just sitting there and thinking about these things, then that's great. Or if you're more into jotting things down, then that is also awesome. So please take some time to identify a moment in which you have experienced others being unconsciously biased towards you. And this doesn't have to be limited to the workplace. This could be in other aspects of your life, but please take a few minutes to reflect on that first question. Okay, so I know some of you may still be doing some reflecting, but we want to move on to our next question. So on the other hand, please also think about a time in which you've been unconsciously biased towards someone else. And again, take a couple minutes to reflect on this question or jot a couple thoughts down. Okay, so because this is a webinar, unfortunately, we're not able to report back as a group, but you may have noticed that as you were reflecting on both of these questions, it was probably easier for you to come up with one example versus the other. And, you know, all of that is going to be dependent on your own personal identities and your lived experiences. So I just want you all to sort of, you know, be mindful of that sort of as we move on with continue with the presentation. But I think this is also an additional reminder that in order for us to really address unconscious bias in our lives, we need to be mindful in the way that we create inclusive spaces for others. Because if we're feeling impacted by unconscious bias, then I'm sure we're also impacting others as well.
So again, this is the reference, this is the the educator who I shared a quote with at the beginning of the presentation, and there's a link here to her full TED Talk, which we highly recommend. One of the things that Verna Myers talks about is as we become aware of these biases, it's really important for us to not hesitate or be afraid or diminish the reality that they exist. But she gives some great tips toward thinking about how can we walk boldly towards these biases and really confront them directly.
Great. So now Dayspring and I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about how do we work through our own unconscious biases. So it's really important that in working through these that we are building awareness. So what does awareness mean in the way that we're defining it here? It means being able to ask yourself, who is your default? Who do you trust? Who are you afraid of? Who do you implicitly feel connected to? Who do you run away from? It might be a particular identity group. It might be people who have been through a specific walk of life. Whoever it is, really think about that and have a sense of awareness of all those questions that I just asked y'all.
So the next step is reflection. So many of us in our graduate programs or in our ongoing professional development may have the opportunity to go to a workshop or a training or a discussion where we are doing some reflection and thinking about our biases or our identities and cultures. But what we really want to encourage all of us to be doing is this reflection on a regular basis, not just in these one-off workshops and trainings, but really incorporating that into our daily practice. So when I leave a meeting, I give myself some time to reflect on how the conversation went, what I said, what I didn't say, what nonverbals I picked up on and didn't pick up on, and really kind of challenge myself and question what assumptions was I making about the other people in the room as I responded or as I spoke up or chose to remain silent, what may have been happening for me that's kind of connected to my own biases and experiences. So that ongoing reflection on a regular basis.
And then also too, with reflection, mindfulness is also very important. And also mindfulness can definitely be a place of discomfort. And so we want to constantly be taking an inventory of who is in our circle, who is missing. In the TED Talk, Verna Myers specifically talks about how there's a lot of unconscious bias towards Black men. And so she talks about this technique of resetting your automatic association about who Black men are. And so if you're constantly seeing in the media or in your social groups or wherever it is, like this constant negative viewpoint towards a specific group or type of individual, then we really want you to challenge yourself to look out and sort of find information that states that the otherwise, that actually says, you know what, this person or this individual or this identity group is amazing and these are the great things that they're doing, so that you start associating the negative unconscious bias towards that group one step at a time.
So that mindfulness is kind of the taking of inventory and noticing maybe what we didn't, taking the time to notice what is not initially obvious to us. And then the next step is continuing to educate ourselves. So there's with confirmation bias, this natural tendency to find evidence that supports our existing beliefs. And that includes sometimes our beliefs that are rooted in prejudice or stereotype. And so it's really important for us to think about ways, especially as some of our unconscious biases become more conscious and we're aware of some of these tendencies within ourselves as we do this reflection and practice this mindfulness, to then actually proactively go out and try to find disconfirming data that will in fact prove that some of our old stereotypes are wrong and challenge some of those assumptions and disrupt some of those like automatic associations that we're making. One really useful tool that is referenced in our handout is the implicit association test. So you can find a link to this online as a tool to do some of that reflection and mindfulness to become more aware of your biases. So there's a number of different tests you can take connected to lots of different associations that we might make. And it kind of gives us a sense of our level of association, strength of association with some different groups or different concepts. So if you take a test like that, then you can use that information to say, okay, now I know that I have this particular bias, and so I need to go out and educate myself to really disrupt that and try to build meaningful relationships, surround myself with different circles, go deeper, closer, further in building those relationships that actually cause us to see somebody as a holistic person that challenges some stereotypes that we might have about that group.
Great. And then also too, we want to highlight bias intervention. I think it's a deeper level of going into unconscious bias. We first started with awareness, which is really important. But once you sort of gone through these different phases, you want to then start creating action steps that are going to not only help your unconscious bias, but also step up when you're seeing someone else being unconsciously biased towards others. And so it goes without saying that, when you see something, we have to have the courage to say something. And that also applies to the people that we love. I think sometimes it can be very easy in our workplace to constantly have our social justice mindset and framework of inclusive communities and stepping up and saying something when we see something happening on our campuses. But then the moment that maybe we go home or we have those family reunions and grandma or grandpa are saying something that's very troubling, I think sometimes there's this tendency to sort of draw in and say, you know what, it's grandma and grandpa. I can't say push back on this. But I think that's where sort of the dangerous piece around unconscious bias lies, is that we're not saying something, and we need to say something because that sort of helps end sort of that cycle. And so it's important that we engage in conversations with loved ones with obviously empathy and honesty. And so continue to keep that in your framework, even outside of the workplace, even outside of that social justice conference that you're attending or Oregon Women in Higher Ed, but to continuously have that framework in every aspect of your life will be really important. And also too, we want to really emphasize and recognize that this is not an easy thing. And so you are not going to get comfortable before you get uncomfortable in sort of tackling these issues around unconscious bias.
I just want to add on to that. I happened to read an interesting study last night that was based on some research tracking on the ground political organizing and canvassing based on trans inclusion and rights for trans and gender nonconforming folks. And so some researchers kind of followed this, and the canvassing was based on intentional, open-ended, empathetic, one-on-one conversations where a person who identified as trans had a conversation with somebody who maybe initially said they would not be supportive of policies that would support trans inclusion and equality. And the research basically showed, in short, that these one-on-one conversations made a difference. And consistently by the end of these conversations, more and more people were saying that they had actually switched their view and were saying that they would support inclusive policies. And so I just want to highlight that because it can feel sometimes really discouraging, and it's much easier to isolate ourselves from relationships, especially family members or loved ones that have these very overt biases or say these problematic things. But it's really important that we find ways to have those hard conversations and be willing to be uncomfortable. And of course, the way that we experience that will be different for each of us based on our own self-care and what we need. And so I don't want to make any assumptions about that. But just, I think I do want to highlight that those conversations can actually have an impact. So on that note, we really wanted to talk about mentorship as a powerful tool for continuing to disrupt our unconscious biases and be a tool for supporting one another as we're navigating these systems. So we know that we're all part of this system that upholds inequities based on identity and experiences. And one way that we can address our unconscious bias and contribute to change is by committing to opening doors for others. So our natural tendency, as we think about especially kind of the, as Claudia was saying earlier, the love of the same, the tendency to be biased towards connecting with those who are similar to us. That's true with mentoring. So our natural tendency is to reach out and build relationships with students or colleagues who are similar to us. And so in taking inventory, it's important for us to consider who are we choosing to mentor and why, and then make a conscious effort to mentor somebody who is different than ourselves. Our training and education doesn't necessarily prepare us for how to navigate these cultural systems within the workplace and beyond. So it be a really powerful way for us to be open and vulnerable with one another about the ways that we're being resilient in the workplace, and be open about the ways that we make mistakes and are biased towards others, and the way that we've pushed against that and continued to educate ourselves. So who we mentor is important, and how we mentor and what we choose to talk about and what we choose to be vulnerable about is equally important. So on that note, this is another TED Talk that we would really encourage you to go back and watch later. So Yasmin Abdel Magdid is a mechanical engineer who also happens to wear a hijab, and she's a writer and a social justice activist. And in this TED Talk, she talks specifically about mentorship and how she is perceived, and how and why some people may choose not to build a relationship with her or mentor her or see her as a leader within her field based on her appearance. And she really challenges us to push through our initial first impressions of people, and again, be really intentional about investing in mentoring relationships with people who are different than us.
Great. So this definitely then moves us to our slide on moving towards action, because we want to make sure that we provide some like handy tools that you can start applying to your lives right now, on best practices for addressing unconscious bias. And also to, like we mentioned before, we will go ahead and share a handout with you all, highlighting action steps that you can take on an individual level, within groups, within your organizations, and also to actions that you can take, things that you can pick from each of these categories and that you can maybe commit to in order to really create inclusive spaces in the different facets of your lives. So we'll go ahead and talk about each one of these, starting off with making sure that you're recognizing and understanding your own unconscious biases. So again, some of that is going to go back to some individual reflection and sort of doing an inventory of, you know, how are you doing under the different aspects of your life? How is your unconscious bias in the workplace? How is your unconscious bias when you're dropping your kids off to school? How is your unconscious bias when you're doing activities outside of work or outside of school? Thinking about those different areas in our lives in which we may be experiencing unconscious bias or being unconsciously biased towards others, and really doing some deep reflection on that will be important.
And this is an ongoing process, so it's not something that you learn and magically you're aware now of your biases and can then work on them. It's an ongoing process. And so it requires us to continually educate ourselves, and then also to help open up opportunities for others to do this reflection and to learn about unconscious bias, who maybe are in a different work environment than us and don't have access to the same kinds of professional development and trainings that we do. So another step is continually attending workshops and trainings that deepen your understanding of these concepts, but then also finding ways to host related workshops, discussions within your neighborhood, maybe within your school PTA, whatever those different outlets are, finding ways to help open up a conversation about this within the workplace and beyond.
And also too, like we're always constantly learning. So definitely have the mentality of being a scholar and an engaged citizen by not only educating yourself about things happening on your campus and also by reading like articles and books, but also too, it's important that we stay up to date with what is happening within our countries and political climates. How is that impacting or influencing the lived experiences of our students, of our family members, or the people that surround us, and also to not just like within higher education or the workplace, but also to within our neighbors. Like, what is our neighbors' lived experience currently at this moment with this political climate? Just really thinking about those things beyond your typical scholarly books and articles, but really go deeper in trying to get some of that education and really be engaged.
So a huge, huge place where bias exists is in our hiring processes, supervision, evaluation. There's lots of studies out there about faculty tenure processes and faculty evaluations. There's less about that on more of the staff side, but I think we can carry over a lot of those same principles. And so you can't really recognize where a bias exists if you're not familiar with your institution's policies and practices around hiring and supervision and evaluation and promotion. So one concrete step is to really familiarize yourself with your particular institution's policies and practices and resources so that then you can be a voice of kind of questioning systems and looking at things through this lens that is kind of seeking out where there might be bias and what you can do to try to address that bias. One example of that within our own hiring process is that Claudia and I have served on several search committees together, and one of the first things that we do in a search is, as a committee, before we even talk about the particular job that we're hiring for, before we even talk about the process itself, one of the first things that we do is talk about what are our particular biases when we're hiring, and what do we know that maybe we have a tendency to really be drawn to people that went to liberal arts institutions because that's the kind of college that we work at, or maybe we have a tendency to be really turned off by people who use particular words or language in their cover letter. So we start by actually talking about that so that then we've named that and brought that into the room, and we can check each other and see when I'm kind of acting based on some of those biases. Claudia can challenge me and say, hey, you might want to think about that, or I don't know that you're giving this person a fair chance.
Yeah, definitely. Accountability is really important. And I think also too, it's really important to build authentic and genuine, meaningful relationships. And I think by doing that, you're also able to, again, check yourselves, and continuously push yourselves to be more inclusive in your practices, but also in the way that you engage with others. So I think in building meaningful relationships with those who are different from you is really important in challenging and replacing our stereotypes. And so one way that I think can be really powerful, I know for myself as a Latina woman, I'm very much drawn to get mentorship from folks who look like me or have similar walks of lives, but some of my best mentors have also been folks who have been completely different from who I am, because they've been able to challenge me and provide me a different perspective that perhaps I wouldn't have gotten if I had just gotten mentorship from folks who had similar identities as I did. And so that can be a really challenging place, right? Because sometimes what that means is that the person that would be providing the mentorship should then reach out to those folks who they can potentially mentor. So put yourself out there, definitely challenge yourself, because we all have something to offer. And so it's really important that we continue to engage with those who are different from us in order to really be inclusive in different aspects of our lives.
So the next action is really just speaking up. So when we see something, speak up and name it. Do what you can to deconstruct what's happening and to interrupt unconscious bias when you see it. So that's going to look different depending on the situation, depending on who you are, your personality. There's lots of different ways to kind of act as a bystander that can all be effective. Sometimes humor can be a really effective tool. Sometimes kind of playing ignorant and asking a question, I don't understand, what did you mean by that? And kind of forcing somebody to clarify what it is that they're saying can be really effective. So there's lots of different tools, but really it's important that we don't act passively, but that when we see unconscious bias, we work to interrupt it.
Great. And Dayspring touched on this a little bit already, but making sure that whether it's within your office or if you're a vice president or have the ability to be at those meetings where a lot of institutional impact can happen, making sure that there are policies and processes that are designed to mitigate the impact of bias whenever possible. And I think part of that also too is in collecting feedback and just providing mechanisms that really sort of put people in check to making sure that you are being forward thinking and you are using inclusive practices. And again, that may look differently depending on your position at an institution or your workplace. And so just wherever you're able to create positive change or sort of like institutionalize whether it's policies or procedures that are inclusive, making sure that you're part of that conversation and that you don't shy away from that. And sometimes that might mean serving in a committee that's outside of your current scope of work, but definitely trying to positively contribute to that will definitely help in making some of those larger institutional changes.
And then the last thing is learning about and practicing restorative justice and incorporating more restorative practices into our everyday work. So this can mean really listening with empathy and listening to understand. So often in our conversations, even within higher education, even in contexts where we think that we have a good understanding about equity and inclusion, and we think that we value diversity at our institutions, when it comes to having hard conversations, we often go into a bit of a debate mode. And we talk with our students about listening with empathy and listening to understand, but we don't always practice that ourselves. So that's something that I think we can really be mindful of working into the way that we lead staff meetings, the way that we participate in division trainings and meetings and conversations that can be challenging. And then also thinking about repairing harm that we've done. So we will make mistakes and we will be the target of somebody else's mistake. And so thinking about how do we respond to that? How do we meet each other with empathy, but also accountability? And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And I think restorative justice is a principle that really highlights the importance of both forgiveness and accountability. And so that's something that I would encourage all of us to continue learning about and then finding ways to incorporate into our practice. And then one of our final notes is about appreciation. So we wanted to highlight the value of appreciation as connected to unconscious bias, because our biases really can impact or influence who we see as having made a valuable contribution within a group, or which ideas we think are worthy of recognition and what we see as valuable. And we all know that it feels good to be recognized. It feels good when a leader in our organization stands in front of the group and recognizes a particular department or a particular staff member for their contributions. So I think it's really important for all of us as leaders to be thinking about what are some ways that we can really affirm one another and affirm the contributions of the group members, and really challenge ourselves to think about what filters might we be using that are influencing who we're appreciating and how we're choosing to appreciate them, and what are some specific ways that we could create more opportunities to show that appreciation and care for one another, and really kind of highlight successes. We're in a culture that really gives us a lot of training around judgment and critique and criticism, and that's something that many of us are very practiced in, I think, within student affairs, but we are sometimes less practiced in really affirming one another and showing that gratitude and highlighting those successes.
Great. So that sort of brings us to the end of the content of this webinar. And at this point, we're open to any questions that any of our listeners may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. First of all, this is Charisse again, the OE Director of Education. I just want to thank you both for bringing this webinar to us, such an important thing. And I wanted to know kind of your opinion on this. So how do you respond? So occasionally there are a lot of, it's kind of like a hot topic right now. People want to talk about unconscious bias and privilege and stuff, but what do you do, or how do you respond when perhaps you're at a training or a meeting where it feels like the presenters are not necessarily passionate or invested or interested in the topic, and perhaps are actually doing it more as this is a way to check the box, and seem to, when they're presenting on, for example, they're talking about unconscious bias, that they're not actually bringing to the table their own privileged identities and how that impacts how they're doing the training and how they're talking about it and how they facilitate the questions of different people who are attending. Do you have any thoughts on this?
That's a great question. I think, unfortunately, that does happen a lot. And I think it's more and more expected within higher education, within corporate contexts, within a lot of different contexts. It's more and more expected that organizations are talking about equity and inclusion, and unconscious bias seems to be this entry point that feels accessible and comfortable to a lot of people. It can feel more less threatening because, we're not intentionally being prejudiced or discriminating against anyone else. We have these things that we've just absorbed from the culture, and that are part of our social learning and are outside of our control. And so that can feel like a less threatening concept to a lot of people, which is why I think there are a lot of trainings right now and discussions about unconscious bias. And I don't know that everyone is necessarily, like you said, Charisse, really approaching it in a way that is grounded in questioning their own identities and experiences and their own biases, or really moving to an action point. So it's one thing to say, okay, we all have these biases, we all have these filters. It's another thing to say, okay, so be accountable for that, be responsible for that, and be proactive in seeking to challenge those biases, look for them within the systems of your organization and disrupt them. And so I think that action piece is really essential. And when maybe you're in a workshop or a training and you feel like that is missing, I think that's one way you could approach it. That's not necessarily critiquing the presenter on a personal level, but maybe pointing out that you would be interested in talking more about that action piece and what are some concrete steps that we can take to hold ourselves and our organizations accountable.
Something also too that I was thinking about was, especially if the training is happening within your own institution, there's opportunity for follow-up. So if your institution is a type where they conduct, I don't know, a safe zone training, and they think that after that, everyone's going to have this sense of awareness and enlightenment and not going to be unconsciously biased towards specific student groups, then I would definitely challenge that of, talking about if there's follow-up trainings in which maybe you can co-facilitate with a facilitator, or there could be a variety of different facilitators, or even talking about different assessment methods and seeing if the trainings being conducted actually help create a more inclusive environment, whether it's in your department or within your division. So sort of like being able to use that as sort of like an accountability measuring efforts to make sure that we're not just sort of putting information out there, but that we're actually following up with it to making sure that it's actually creating the type of positive space that we sort of like envision. And then I think also too, like anytime that there's opportunity to like provide feedback, you know, whether it's an anonymous form or not, I think it's also really important. So yeah, those are just a couple things that I can think of in addition to what Dayspring has shared.
Mhm. One other thing I'd add, I guess, is that if that's something you're noticing, I can almost guarantee there's somebody else in the room that's noticing that too. And if you don't speak up in some way, that really can change kind of the outcome of that training. And so again, it's going to depend on the context and what feels appropriate. But I think if there's a possible way to say something that sort of nuances the conversation a little bit more, that can be an important way to affirm other people in the room that may be having the same experience, so that they know that they're not alone, and that you are, again, finding a point for building meaningful relationships outside of that context, and making your organization inclusive.
Thank you. So there's a couple other questions here. One person asked, can you give some examples of institutional feedback mechanisms? Possibly like assessment. How do you assess unconscious bias within the institution, or how things are changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple tools that we highlighted in our pre-conference workshop that we hadn't planned to share here, but I would be happy to send out. So there's, more in-depth kind of benchmark tools that you can use to do some auditing of your organization and the organizational culture and climate and policies. But there's also some really quick and easy kind of audits that you can do. So one tool, a colleague and I attended a session on unconscious bias a few years ago, and we were in the same session and kind of in different smaller discussion groups, and we both did this same audit of our institution. And then afterward, we compared our results and had some great conversation about the places where we had similarities and the places where we had completely different answers to questions. And so obviously that was influenced based on our own experience of the institution and our own identities. And so I think that simple audits like that can be a great tool to do within a small team or as a division, to get a sense of kind of what some of the themes are and where maybe there are some sticking points within your organization and the climate that you might want to address, but then also just to open up the conversation about the fact that each of you are answering those questions differently. And that in and of itself kind of reinforces the point that we all have these different filters. So we can send a few of those out with the resources.
That would be great. Another viewer asked how you can, so how do you know if people's biases towards you are motivated, are unconscious bias, or if they're intentional?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? I feel like...
Sorry. So there was that kind of, people were talking to one another a little bit here in the chat, Zoom group chat, but somebody was trying to process how to kind of respond to people, like to bias that they were experiencing maybe, and to try to, and maybe it helps them think about how they're responding to the person, I guess. But they were asking, how do you know if bias is motivated by unconscious bias or if it's intentional? Like they're purposefully doing something. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. I don't know that you can know. I think that's a complicated question. Go ahead.
I mean, I guess it's tricky, right? We always want to assume best intentions of people, but the reality is like there are not so great people out there. But I think, we're talking about, right, creating institutional policies and procedures and systems in which protect one another, right? And so what I would say is that if you're feeling that someone is doing something that's negatively impacting you, whether that's through a microaggression or whether that is through like actionable things that are happening within your working experience or your personal experience, to really seek the advice of a mentor or look into your institutional policies and see if there's anything there that seems to be like not quite right. And if it seems that that person is definitely crossing the boundary with any form of like harassment or whatever it is, to definitely utilize the institutional policies and procedures to sort of like move forward with that. Also too, I've worked at other institutions where they've had ombuds offices, which is essentially a place where you can go and get some anonymous advice, both for like, it works both with students, faculty, and staff from this office, and you can tell them about your experience, what is going on, and then they can sort of give you some more advice and like point you to the right resources and how to sort of deal with that workplace conflict or that thing that you're experiencing that just gives you this weird gut feeling. I know not all institutions have ombuds offices, but I think anytime you have the opportunity to sort of bounce back ideas, whether it's from someone outside of the institution and just sort of running past them, whatever experience it is that you're facing, I think gives you a better clarity of, is this really in my head, or is this something that like this person's actively trying to cause harm to me? And if it's the case that maybe the person is being unconsciously biased towards you, then I think at that point, strategizing ways in which you sort of address that conversation are really important, because as much as, I think we tend to shy away from conflict, it's really important that we address it, because if you're feeling that type of tension, then I'm sure that students may be feeling that type of tension, right, from that particular individual. So it's really important that we sort of really face situations like that if you feel that you wouldn't be jeopardizing your own personal well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I would agree definitely with everything that Claudia said. And I think that sometimes shifting the focus away from trying to understand somebody's motivations or intentions to really just focusing on the impact of their actions and the way that it's affecting you and the harm that it's causing for you is important, because then what you can do is focus on, okay, how are you going to navigate this? And what are your resources for support so that you can be resilient? Because that's where mentorship comes in. So I think about, for myself, from the times when I've had those experiences in the workplace where something has happened and I felt like somebody is being biased towards me, or there's some layers there that I need to unpack. Like, is this in my head? What's happening? What are the different dynamics? What I have found so useful is having those go-to people that I can just talk with, who are going to hear me out and not question and not really focus on what were the person's motivations and did they intend to harm me or not, but are really just going to listen and affirm my experience and then help me navigate, okay, what are my next steps? How do I want to do that? How do I want to go forward? And sometimes that might mean figuring out kind of my strategies to avoid this person, or figure out how I'm going to interact with them in the future that mitigates some harm that they could cause me in the future. So it may not be that it rises to the level that I think I want to go through an official channel of, a bias report or reporting some sort of harassment, but really I can get that immediate form of support from mentors and colleagues who will just listen to me and not question my experience.
Thanks, Dayspring and Claudia. I kind of have a follow-up question, but it was from somebody a little while ago, but they're asking, so Dayspring, you started talking about how you have people you go to. when you're talking about this or processing. And she said, do either of you have thoughts about how to share your processing in professional conversations with colleagues? She said, examples of times you have called out yourself, others, or language you have used. So examples like, how do you end up sharing with colleagues or talking about this and calling out if necessary?
Mhm. Well, I'm in a position where I am asked to do this a lot, just given the nature of my role, where I am often leading conversations with students about equity and inclusion. And it, to me, an important practice in leading those conversations is self-disclosure and vulnerability. And so I try to, before I even enter into this is different, this is within the context of a planned conversation. So within the context of a planned conversation, I almost always try to go in with an example of in my head that I would be comfortable sharing, so that either I can lead with that, or if the right moment comes up, I'm not awkwardly fumbling in my mind of like, ooh, what do I feel comfortable sharing? But I already have some examples in my head. So for me, that's been useful. As far as kind of calling out colleagues or naming things in the moment, I think for me, some of that has come through just in growing confidence and just ongoing practice of doing that, sometimes really tentatively or timidly, and then learning what works and what's effective depending on the context. Some of it, I think, again, is deeply tied to our own identities and experiences. So I'm a white woman in a role doing equity work, where I am expected to say things that will make others in the room uncomfortable. And when I do that, I might make others uncomfortable, but I have not ever been in a position where I felt like my job was on the line. And so the risks for me are different. And I think that that's important to acknowledge too, that when we're talking about how to challenge some of these biases in the workplace, we have to really think about our different experiences and how each of us are going to challenge those in our own ways. And we want to be supportive of each other, and not expect that somebody else is going to do it in the exact same way that we would.
Yeah, and so I guess for me, in the times where I've called it out, so, I want to acknowledge that, like sometimes depending on your position, you might have a little bit more of leeway on, the type of conversations that you can be more challenging towards. And so for me, I found that there hasn't been any experiences that I've had where I've felt comfortable enough addressing things like right there in the moment, at least as it relates to workplace dynamics. However, what I've sort of done in the past has been, let's say there's a meeting and something happens, I try to touch base with the person who I felt said something really troubling immediately after, and just be like, hey, can we touch base, or can we follow up later today? Or if it really sort of takes me a little time to think about it on how I'm going to address it, I try to send them an email and say that, hey, there's a couple of things that I have some concerns about. Can we touch base? So I think it's really challenging in the moment. Honestly, I felt more comfortable having those like tough conversations when it's been like friends or like family members who I'm like, they're like blood at the end of the day. Like, let me challenge you. Like, I have no problem stepping up and saying things then. But when it comes to like workplace settings and things like that, I know that I've definitely struggled with that. So the compromise that I've sort of built upon myself in the meantime has been to try to address it as quickly as possible, even if that means not immediately in the moment, but also to following up with whoever perhaps was negatively impacted by that stated comment. So if it's a student, trying to follow up later, trying to get their thoughts and their opinions. But yeah, that's something that I've at least been able to do within the context of my position and sort of my role within the institution.
I've also had times where I have done something harmful, said something harmful, and for me, it's been really important to think about how to not center myself in follow-up to that or in apologizing. So I've had times where that has happened where with a student where in the moment, pretty much as soon as I said something, I'm like, oh no, that was like, I was just like so out of touch with my experience is different than yours. And I can't believe I just said that or made an assumption about your experience. And when I'm aware of it, because sometimes you don't realize it till after the fact, and then you're really like, oh no. But when that happens and I'm aware of it in the moment, I try to just briefly like acknowledge it, like, oh, I just realized what I said, and I'm really sorry, and not spend a lot of time talking about it, because that can really center our own emotions and put the person who's been harmed in the position of trying to like reassure you that it's all okay. And then depending on the situation, if it's appropriate, maybe I'll send a follow-up email, but be really clear to say like, please don't feel any need to respond. I just wanted to, again, like kind of acknowledge what I did and why it was harmful. So that's been one thing that I experienced.
All right. Well, thank you so much once again for everything you've shared with us today. It was really awesome. Oh, and we have your contact information. So I plan to share whatever resources you want. We'll share with the people who signed up for it and weren't able to make it, and also on the website for those people who would like to see it later. So with that, I want to thank you both and wish everybody well. Have a great week.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.